It might be a little bit too late to say this. It is the 1st of February, but Happy New Year to you all. And I hope that 2024 has kicked off in a fantastic style for you. My name's Amy Peacock. I'm a researcher at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. I'd like to start by paying our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, which in my case is the Mawinea people. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, noting that our speakers and our audience are joining us from many locations across Australia and the world today. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and extend that same respect to any First Nations people joining us today. So it's the first webinar series of the year, and that means we need to start off on a very special note. So today we have not one, but 2 webinar speakers for you. I'm delighted to introduce them to you. We have Dr. Wing See Yuen. Wing is a research fellow at NDARC. Her research interests include examining trends, trajectories, and predictors of alcohol and other substance-related harm in specific populations, including young people and people who identify as LGBTQ+. We also have Dr. Simon Clay. Simon is also a research fellow at NDARC, and Simon's research focuses on the relationship between drug use, substance dependence treatment, and well-being, with a particular focus on risk and embodiment. Wing and Simon are going to be presenting today on a program of work undertaken in collaboration with ACON, which is New South Wales' leading HIV and LGBTQ+ health organisation, and also in collaboration with New South Wales Cancer Institute. This program of work really sought to explore alcohol-related behaviours, beliefs, and knowledge around cancer risk among LGBTQ+ adults in New South Wales, with the goal of informing health promotion efforts targeted at these populations. And in light of these collaborations, we're really excited that we've got 2 excellent panelists joining us today. We have Scott Walsberger. So Scott is Cancer Programs Manager at ACON. He leads programs to raise awareness of cancer risks and screening among LGBTQ+ communities and improve inclusivity among health services, and has over 15 years of experience in cancer control. We also have Nikki Woolley, who is the Portfolio Manager for Healthy Living and Skin Cancer Prevention at the Cancer Institute, New South Wales. As I mentioned, New South Wales Health Cancer Control Agency. Nikki has over 30 years experience in Australia and New Zealand, working alongside diverse communities to improve health and wellbeing across a range of areas, including alcohol and other drugs. So we're going to have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please do send them through. If you can you put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, and I'll present them to our speakers and to our panelists at the end of the presentation. I'll try to answer as many as possible. But as per usual, that's enough from me. I might ask Wing to turn on her camera and to kick us off with the first presentation. Thanks, Wing.
Thanks, Amy. So before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across New South Wales, particularly because that's where our work was undertaken, and pay our respects to elders past and present, and also especially to the Gadigal, Bedigal and Camaragal peoples, upon whose lands NDARC, ACON and Cancer Institute New South Wales are located. And of course, we'd like to thank our participants for their time and contribution to our studies. And this work would not have been possible without the expertise of everyone from ACON, Cancer Institute New South Wales, and NDARC in this collaboration. This work was funded by ACON under the LGBTQ Cancer Screening and Prevention Program, which is in turn funded by the Cancer Institute of New South Wales. So why LGBTQ people and alcohol and perceptions of cancer? Well, LGBTQ people are a priority population for cancer control currently, due to lower rates of engagement in cancer screening processes and also high rates of risk factors such as alcohol and tobacco use. There's also that general public awareness of alcohol use as a risk factor for cancer is poor, but it's not super clear whether this also applies for LGBTQ people. So currently there's a need for LGBTQ inclusive cancer-related health messaging, and to help inform that, we need more data on LGBTQ people's alcohol-related behaviours, beliefs, and knowledge of health risks. So with that in mind, I'll be presenting the results of a quantitative survey. Simon will be presenting about some qualitative interviews, and then the panel will come together for a discussion as mentioned. The quantitative survey component was the study of drinking and health amongst LGBTQ people, also known as SOTA+. This was a cross-sectional cohort of 1,499 participants recruited in November to December of 2022, with our inclusion criteria being LGBTQ identifying, aged 18 years or older, and currently residing in New South Wales. They completed for us an online survey, which consisted of 4 main components. So first was just general demographics, then next was alcohol use, and then perceptions of health risks related to alcohol use, and finally help-seeking behaviours related to alcohol use. And I'll go through each of these, but just quickly through the demographics bit. For gender, we had a quite large proportion of cisgender women participating, which is typical of online survey studies. And around half of our participants identified as gay or lesbian. Our participants also skewed a bit younger in age, with a mean age of 34 years, and they generally resided in the Greater Sydney area, which is pretty consistent with the general population. On the more interesting side, for the alcohol use behaviours, as you might expect, most of our participants had consumed alcohol in their lifetime, with about 9 in 10 having consumed alcohol in the past 12 months. And most of the results that I'll be presenting next will be about this subsample. So about half of our participants consumed alcohol monthly or less often. But more importantly, we were interested in their consumption on a typical drinking day and per week. So the Australian government has some guidelines to reduce health risks from drinking alcohol. And one of them is to drink no more than 4 standard drinks on any one day, because that will help reduce the risk of experiencing acute harms or short-term harms. So around 31% of our participants exceeded this guideline in the past 12 months. And these people were more likely to be younger, so aged 18 to 24. They were more likely to be cisgender men, transgender women, and people living in rural or remote areas of New South Wales. The other guideline that we wanted to benchmark against was the weekly guideline. So that is no more than 10 standard drinks in a week, and about 1 in 4 of our participants exceeded this guideline. Instead of being younger, these participants were more likely to be aged 40 or over, and they were also more likely to be cisgender men, similar to the single day guideline. So with that being said, ACON and the Cancer Institute New South Wales were particularly interested in what people perceive to be the health risks of alcohol use. So we're moving on to that. So first up, how did participants perceive their own drinking? There was quite an interesting pattern here, where the people who drank more per year, so exceeded the weekly guideline, they drank at least 11 drinks or more per week. They were more likely to report that they perceived their alcohol use as being somewhat harmful or very harmful compared to the people who drank less. So there was quite high awareness that their alcohol use was harmful to their health. And the other main aspect was related to cancer risk and other health problems. So what did people think that, what health problems did people think were related to alcohol use? What we really wanted to get at was, are you aware that alcohol use is linked to cancer? But we can't ask that of people because by asking them, we're telling them that there's a link. So instead, we asked them in a sort of roundabout way. The first half was using this question. So what health conditions do you think can result from drinking too much alcohol? And this was just a free text response. They could type whatever they wanted without any sort of examples given. So we call this unprompted awareness. And then on the next page of the survey, without having the chance to go back and change the answers, we asked the question, which of these health conditions, if any, do you think can result from drinking too much alcohol? And we just gave them a list and got them to check the box for which ones they thought were linked to alcohol. And this one we called prompted awareness because of the prompts that we gave them. So the results for the unprompted awareness, the free text response, look like this in this word cloud / word square. And about 1 in 3 of our participants named cancer as a health risk without having any sort of prompting. And when we move on to that checklist, these are the results. You can ignore the colors for now. I won't go into that because of time issues. But essentially, cancer ranked 9th most common, commonly selected of the health risks that we presented. So in summary, there was a pretty even split across the different levels of awareness. So around a third unprompted, an additional third when we gave them the checklist, and about a third of them were completely unaware that alcohol was a risk for cancer. The people who selected who named cancer as potential health risk were more likely to be people who drank 11 or more drinks per week, so that's exceeding the weekly guideline. They were more likely to be aged 20 to 59 years than to be younger, and they were also more likely to be cisgender women. And interestingly, the people who drank both 11 plus drinks per week and 4 or more drinks per occasion, so exceeding both of those guidelines, they were less likely to be unaware. So flipping that around, it would be they were more likely to be aware. So the highest risk people were more likely to be aware that cancer was a risk. And then we were also interested in the different types of cancer. So the diagram on the right there is courtesy of the Cancer Institute of New South Wales, which lists the most common cancers linked to alcohol use. And we asked of the participants to select the ones that they thought were linked to alcohol. Most of the top answers were on this diagram, but interestingly, breast or chest cancer, which is linked to alcohol, was not very commonly selected. Only about 1 in 5 people thought it was related to alcohol use. And finally, we have help-seeking behaviours. So about 3 in 4 participants who drank at risky levels did not seek help to reduce their alcohol use, and we wanted to know the most common reasons why they didn't seek help. And the top 3 were about feeling that they had reduced their alcohol use without seeking help, feeling embarrassed, shamed, or judged about seeking help, or that they didn't feel ready to seek help. And then on the flip side, of those 1 in 4 participants who drank at risky levels and they sought help to reduce their alcohol use, we wanted to know why they did. And the top 3, there was a common theme of wanting to address future problems or improve health more generally. So in summary, this is what we found. I don't want to eat up too much of Simon's time, but essentially we were quite interested in diving a little bit deeper with the experiences, particularly of older LGBTQ people, because they were more likely to drink at rates that were more harmful in the long term. So that sort of 11 plus drinks in a typical week, people were more likely to be older. So we wanted to know more about their lived experiences. So without further ado, here is Simon.
There we go. Hi, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you, Wing, for that wonderful introduction to what I'm about to present. So as Wing said, we were really curious to go a bit deeper into the findings of the survey to find out what the lived experience was, and just work out a little bit more about what people actually thought about alcohol, their own alcohol use and cancer risk, and to try and unpick the complexities of what was going on. So we had pretty broad set of demographics here. We were looking at people between the ages of 30 to 59. And as you can see, the bulk of them were between 30 to 39. The majority were cis men, but we had a small amount of cis women, trans people, and non-binary people. Again, there was a heavy skew towards gay men, but we did have a pretty sizable portion of other sexualities. In terms of alcohol consumption, people were relatively moderate. We didn't have people who drank quite a lot regularly. The majority just had a few drinks each week. With the interviews themselves, they went for roughly about 45 minutes, so they were quite substantial. And I'd like to credit to my colleague, Chris Popovsky, who did conduct all the interviews. So, drinking patterns. When we asked people about how often they drank and when they drank, there was a really wide diversity of responses. So some people like to have drinks only on the weekend. Some people kept their drinking confined to the week. Some felt that they would only like to drink on the evenings or on social occasions. But confining their alcohol consumption to a certain period was a way of controlling it, of managing it, and creating boundaries around what felt okay. My participant Daniel frames this in terms of acceptability. So he said, I like to have my drinks close to the later part of the day. I've had 1 or 2 pints of beer before around 4 p.m. I'll often have a drink after I've clocked off work and I've generally had a crazy busy day and I'm just like, I need something to shake that tension off. But generally anything past 4 p.m., I consider it relatively acceptable. So the amount that participants regularly drank tended to reduce as they got older. There was this perception or this feeling that when they were younger, in their 20s, those were their partying years. So they would be going out lots, they would be going to a lot of social events, and just the drinking culture when they were younger was a lot stronger. And as they got older, it was less of a priority. They had bigger things to look after. So they had a family, they had kids, they had a full-time job that they had other responsibilities. And so alcohol was not as interesting to them anymore. My participant, Andy, highlights this relationship between maturity and reduced drinking. He said, I think with a bit of maturity, your alcohol intake goes down. I don't do that other stuff that I was doing in my early 20s anymore. So my relationship to alcohol is different. In my early 20s, I used to go out 3 or 4 nights a week and drink until I was completely drunk, whereas now it's something I do at home to relax. The maturity of not drinking as much meant that people who did drink lots were seen as immature, that they were drinking. That mature drinking was about appreciating it. It was about respecting it, which I thought was a really interesting phrase. Whereas people who drank to get drunk were seen as immature and obnoxious. They were something that wasn't really pleasant to be around and someone to be avoided. So when asked about the signs and expressions of risky drinking, what felt like risky drinking to you, there was, again, a really broad range of responses. But often it came about in very abstract ways, not in relation to themselves. It was always, I think risky drinking is like this, or if I saw risky drinking, it would look like this. It was rarely, for me, risky drinking is this. Participants often had to be prompted and asked directly what they thought it would feel like for them. Alcohol dependence was a major one that people referenced, but the main risk of the alcohol dependence was its ability to creep in. There was this idea that it would slowly merge into someone's life, and there wouldn't be this moment where you would think, oh, this is a problem, it would just gradually happen until one day you would wake up and think, when did this happen? Elliot said, I think risky drinking is not just consuming huge amounts of alcohol and getting really inebriated quickly. I think risky drinking for me is how it can creep up on you. There's nothing catastrophic about it, but I think over a period of time, if you fall into that habit of drinking every day and it becomes normal, then I think that's probably more risky than just drinking large amounts of alcohol in a short time. I think it's when it's over a long period of time and it becomes a habit, then it can be risky. Another compounding risk associated with developing a dependence was that people would compare themselves to this image of the abject alcoholic, which I thought was fascinating. There was this picture that participants would paint of this elderly, homeless man drinking metho on the streets. That was what an alcoholic looked like. So if they didn't match that image, then they didn't have a problem. So there was this separation, this bifurcation of, if you don't look like that, then you don't have a problem, or your drinking isn't at a problematic stage. But if you do look like that, then it's time to get serious about your alcohol and to really change your relationship to it. Losing control and making bad decisions was another risk that quite a few participants raised. And there were two aspects to this losing control. So there was the one of you were making bad decisions, like going home with a stranger or putting yourself into a dangerous situation. But then there was also the losing control of how much substance you were consuming and losing control of how much and what you were drinking. There was also this notion of engaging in risky or regrettable behavior, and this was an extension of the losing control. Cody, he spoke about how he would sometimes worry about the social repercussions of his drinking and that the impact of cumulative social faux pas and negative social situations might have on his friendships and broader relationships. He said, I think risky drinking is more about my behavior and how I've acted when I've been drinking. It's like, have I been rude to my friends? Have I been inappropriate? Have I woken up being like, shit, I'm not happy with the way I acted last night? I think of one incident where I probably had a bit too much than everyone else around me. We were all staying in a hotel and I kind of jokingly said, I'm going to take advantage of being in a hotel and get on Grindr and invite someone over. I thought I had said it quietly, and then the people that were there were like, do you realize how loudly you said that? And I was like, shit, I feel so bad. It was with a couple of people that I didn't know super well, and I was like, I hope that didn't come across as bad. So there was this sense of regret and almost cringe at some of the things that you would do, and that was the risk, the social damage that might come of it. An extension of this losing control and this risky behavior was connected to vulnerability, that you would forget to watch your drinks, that you would put yourself in a dangerous situation, that you would go home with someone who might be a little sketchy, that you wouldn't tell your friends where you're going, or that you would become too drunk and pass out somewhere public. And by extension, this puts a greater responsibility on the other people around you to care for you. And so that creates a whole host of complexities as well. One final risk that a lot of people mentioned was that there's a point at which alcohol starts to affect the rest of your life, the other aspects of your life. And this was when you should start to reconsider your relationship to alcohol. So participants spoke about if alcohol and hangovers were starting to infringe on your ability to go to work, if it was impacting on your relationships, if it was impacting on your family life, it was having a negative impact on these things, then that was something that needed to be addressed and looked at quite seriously. So we asked people about their health concerns or the health impacts that they associate with alcohol use before asking them about cancer. And these were some of the key things that came out, and some of the more interesting things that came out as well. In general, participants were incredibly health conscious and very, very health literate. And a lot of them spoke about how they went to their doctor quite regularly, had very open conversations about their substance use with their GP or with their counsellor, were getting regular blood tests to measure their liver health if they were quite heavy drinkers. And a lot also emphasized how they were practicing healthy practices. They were going to the gym more, they were going for runs, they were trying to eat better. So a couple of participants brought up the issue of diabetes because of the high sugar amount in a lot of alcohol, particularly wine. Some avoided high sugar drinks to reduce their sugar intake and so would opt for spirits rather than pre-mixed drinks or wine. But Caitlin described the impact that alcohol had on her blood sugar levels and diabetes and how she had to ensure that she maintained a moderate intake of alcohol. She said, "I have type 1 diabetes and I don't think alcohol is really great for me because it has the effect of lowering your blood sugar. So I do have a pump, which is great, but yeah, I've woken up in the middle of the night from my pump alarm saying you're low, which is fine for me, but for my partner, of course, she wakes up with the alarm." I think this quote is really interesting because it highlights how other people become involved in this as well. It's not just one person's sugar intake and weight and health, that it does have social implications as well, or it can do. Another participant, Ian, said that he had taken to cider quite well. He had had one and really liked it, and so was really enjoying having quite a lot of cider. But he had begun to get really intense sugar cravings as a result. And so when he wanted to cut down, he found it quite difficult, not mainly because of the alcohol, but because he wanted the sugar. And he was a little confronted by this, which I thought was quite interesting. And so that was something that he was trying to manage on an ongoing basis. Mental health, of course, was quite a big topic when speaking to participants about the health impacts. A lot of them spoke about how alcohol had a negative impact on their depression or anxiety. It would cause them to have a spike. It would put them into bed for a couple of days as a result for some participants. But there was also this interesting tension of people would drink to enhance a really happy occasion, or they would drink to make themselves feel better when they were really low. But if they drank when they were really happy, then they would feel really sad the next day. And if they drank when they were feeling sad and they felt better temporarily, then they would feel worse the next day as well. So there was this interesting tension or this balance that a lot of participants were trying to find. There was one participant, or actually there was a few participants who had opted for cannabis instead of alcohol, primarily because alcohol didn't do a lot for them in terms of their mental health and they didn't really enjoy the way that it felt. But also cannabis itself was beneficial for their mental health. So moving to that actually had a two-pronged element to it. Weight gain was a really big topic when it came to alcohol-related health issues. And gaining weight often prompted some to reduce their alcohol intake. The weight gain was partly because of the extra calories, the empty calories that comes from alcohol, but also all the junk food that you would eat while you were drinking, as well as what happens to food when you do consume alcohol, that it is metabolized in a different way. The weight gain negatively affected some participants' mental health, and so the mental health also came into why they wanted to reduce their alcohol intake. Some participants who did decide to lose weight and cut out alcohol described being quite successful at first, that they did make really big changes to their life. They went to the gym, they had changed their diet, they had made some really big changes to just how they work day to day, but this was always temporary. It always stopped at some point. A lot of participants mentioned the relationship between organ damage, particularly liver, and high alcohol use, but this was always a hypothetical concern. None of the participants have reduced their intake at that time because of their concern around organ health, because this was an idea that only people at that extreme end, the abject alcoholic, was only at risk of liver damage. Some had been a little concerned at some point in the past, but had gone to see their GP and said that there hadn't been any, none of the tests came back indicating that they had liver damage. When asked about the relationship between cancer and alcohol, there was an interesting departure from Wing's findings because virtually none of the participants knew about it. There was very, very little awareness. They were often very surprised to find out that there was a relationship because there was this perception that in terms of physical health, the main concern was liver damage. The participants who had heard of the connection only knew about it in very, very general terms, in that there is a relationship. And this information reinforced other participants' beliefs around alcohol's inherent riskiness and why it's really important to moderate your intake. There was some uncertainty as to why there wasn't more awareness around this link if it is so serious. Elliot discusses this, and he says, "To be honest, when I read through the participant information sheet you sent, I was surprised to see that cancer was mentioned so specifically in there. I don't think I'd ever really heard about that before, so that was quite surprising. I honestly had never heard of that link before, which I thought was strange. Well, not strange, but I thought if there's a link there, then why isn't it more widely known? Or how come I haven't heard about it before? I thought that was really interesting. It reminded me of cigarette companies when that link between cancer and smoking was just never mentioned. It was never highlighted. It was never brought attention to." Some thought the lack of awareness was because of the prevalent belief that alcohol was generally a low risk substance because of its ubiquity. It's everywhere, so it can't be that harmful. And that tobacco and illicit drugs, those were the main concerns. Those were the really dangerous things, but alcohol is pretty innocuous in comparison. Others thought the invisibility of cancer might also be a contributing factor too. Andy said, "I don't feel like it gets a lot of promotion, cancer and stuff like that. I don't know, but it's also probably very hard to get that message across. So I'm not sure what people's knowledge around that is. Cancer's an invisible thing, you know? Like with domestic violence or something like that, it's obvious and it's easy to sort of engage, whereas this is like you can't really see it and it might hurt you at some point." Finally, some challenged this relationship between cancer and alcohol and said that there were just too many factors that surround cancer, that you can't just say it's because of this definite factor, that all sorts of things come into it: stress, diet, location, genetics. And so to say that there is a relationship is not so much a dangerous statement, but it's something that can't be said with confidence. So I might wrap up there to give us some time for questions and discussions. So I might throw back to Amy.
Yes, thank you. Round of applause for Wing and Simon. Thank you so much for those fantastic presentations. You are both two of my favourite presenters. Very different styles, equally captivating, I would say, and both giving us some really fantastic insights here. I think both as to the value of using qualitative and quantitative data in combination, look to see what melds, but what potentially is a little bit different. But also just the value of this work. And I don't want to preempt what Scott and Nikki are going to talk about, but the value of this work in really informing how we increase awareness and try and reduce some of those risks. So I might invite everyone to turn on their cameras, Wing, Scott, and Nikki. And I might start with you, Scott. I just asked if you have any immediate reflections on that talk, but also I might put you on the spot a little bit to talk about how these data can be used moving forward in a practical sense.
Yep. Thank you, Amy. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. And I'd also like to thank the Cancer Institute for investing in the work we do in cancer programs and the equity focus on LGBTQ communities, and also for NDARC for partnering on this and helping us, bring the strength and the knowledge you guys have in regards to alcohol to this research and the research expertise. It's been a great partnership and really valuable to us. I think that, it's really important. This work is really important because we don't often have data that gives us insights into our communities, and particularly on some of these issues. We have more research and data on alcohol and drug use within our communities, but not in connection with chronic diseases like cancer. Or we have, great data and research on sexual health and stuff with our communities, but there's often gaps in what we do have from a cancer perspective. And where there is, the data is often aggregated for our communities, and we miss a lot of the important nuances that might happen in different parts of our communities. And that's really important for us to plan and respond in our health promotion campaigns and work. So I just want to really reflect on that. And I guess that's a broader call out to all the researchers on the webinar today, that good data collection on gender and sexuality throughout research is really important, and collecting that and reporting it appropriately and disaggregated at a more micro level is really important, because it gives us the insights that we need. So this is really important work. And sometimes there's similarities to the general population, but there's also really important differences that we find in parts of our community that act and respond differently to health promotion campaigns, or disease awareness. The priorities that our communities might see and experience every day in their life may not be the same as the general population. And possibly that might explain why, in Simon's work, the awareness of cancer seems to, talking about it as invisible, where I'm sure other people who are on this webinar today and that work in cancer don't see that as cancer being an invisible disease. So I think it's important that we do that. And, I think the other reflection here is that alcohol consumption is a really complex issue, and will take lots of multi-pronged approaches to reduce alcohol consumption and to reduce the diseases, including cancer, that can result in this overconsumption of alcohol above those risky categories. But I think this research helps to inform us on what we can do and where we can start, and particularly our interest is in on that a public health campaign targeting our communities, and so it can inform and give us insights as to what that work might look like. So I might stop there and hand over to somebody else, but happy to take more questions.
Thanks, Scott, and some really good messages in your talk just then, particularly calling out to those researchers to think about the nuance when we are asking those questions around gender and sexuality diverse populations. Nikki, thoughts from you on this research?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear the differences and similarities across the quantitative and qualitative studies. I'd like to acknowledge country too. I'm on Dharawal country here, and the main reason why Cancer Institute New South Wales is so involved and interested in this area is because a lot of people don't realise that alcohol is actually a group 1 carcinogen, just like tobacco. It's certainly not seen in that way because it is so ubiquitous, as tobacco has been and is. So you can see that reflected in the Australian guidelines. The longer term risk of cancer from alcohol consumption is why there's no more than 10 standard drinks in a week for the general adult population. And also the New South Wales Cancer Plan, one of its primary aspects is the importance of equity of cancer outcomes, which includes equity of access to health information, health services. So we need to work in a really useful way to try and make a contribution to improve the health of LGBTQ plus people. We're a generalist organisation, so it's really important for us to partner, and it's been a really fruitful partnership with ACON and now also NDARC. Research has shown there's a lack of awareness of the risk between alcohol and cancer, or it's not weighted as heavily as other risks and in the general population, and it seems in this population. But it's interesting to note that in the quant study, people who drank more were more aware of the cancer risk, and there was not that great level of awareness in the qual study, which is interesting, smaller group, and very different in many ways. So I think it's really important to acknowledge, and I've been a health promoter for a while, information is not enough to change behaviour. And as Scott said, it requires a whole range of interventions consistently across a whole, from policy to personal behaviour to environment. But it's a good start to share information, especially if it's in a relatable context of a campaign. And so we think that's a really good next step. And also just acknowledge that cancer risk doesn't seem to be a key motivator from these studies, but would this increase if people were more aware of that link? So we're going to keep working with ACON on the campaign. We're very excited about this, and it's building on other really successful cancer screening campaigns that we've worked on with ACON. I think we really want to increase health literacy, and especially for people who are looking for that information, where cancer is a concern or it's in the family, or they're thinking about that and realizing the impacts of alcohol in their lives. So that's some of my thoughts just to start with. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Nikki. There's so many things I want to pick up from what you and Scott have just said, but I will go to the Q&A, and please continue to put questions in the Q&A. I noticed there's a question or comment here from Bridget. Fascinating that participants were so well health educated but knew very little about the cancer links to alcohol. Simon, I might throw to you first. Did you talk to participants about the idea of health promotion campaigns, or what supports or advice they may want around cancer risk and around their alcohol consumption?
Yes. So we asked about both things. In terms of seeking support, it was a real mixed bag. A lot of people were very selective in who they would feel comfortable approaching. But generally it was people who had a similar lived experience, or people who kind of knew the field. They would feel most comfortable approaching them. In terms of campaigns, a lot of people pointed to the safer sex campaigns that they saw in the 90s and early 2000s directed at queer people around HIV and other STIs, because they said they were very positive, they were very affirming, but they also kind of empowered us to look after our health. So if you were going to do a campaign, I think that's a really good paradigm to work within. Yes, I think that answers the question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I mean, I might add on to that and ask Scott and or Nikki, when you saw the results from this research, were there kind of really key findings from it that stuck out to you that you went, if I'm designing a health campaign, I should really think about this aspect of the results or this aspect? Like, were there particular pieces of particular findings that were going to be really helpful in that respect? Scott, can I put on Nikki? Do you want to go first? Scott?
Yeah. I'm happy to respond first. I think one thing that this research did is help us narrow down who our target audience would be, because I think the insights about where the drinking patterns and particularly age groups, but also helping us to know that this is a campaign that probably needs broad reach across our communities, and not something that we're not at a point where we need to just focus on some of the subgroups within our communities. And I think the other part is that how people see support and their need when they're at a point when they should be seeking support or considering changing their behaviors, and then what that support looks like. And I think this gives us a lot of insights into how we will develop a campaign. So it's not judgmental. It kind of helps inform people that maybe I'm at a point where I need to start changing my behavior and starting to go down that path, but doing that in a very supportive, empathetic, and empowering way, rather than, I think our communities probably have felt a lot of judgment throughout their lives, and particularly on issues like this, and that's not going to be a constructive. Piling on more judgment and kind of fear is not going to be a constructive way to supporting our communities to change behaviors.
Yeah, I'd add that it's a conversation, I feel, with a really diverse community with a whole range of experiences. And if those conversations can be stimulated through a campaign, then I think that's going to be really great, because this range of different life experiences and issues that people are experiencing and managing, and that may or may not include alcohol. So I think it was the breadth of the results and some of the splits about recognition to do with cancer and prompted and unprompted were really interesting to me. I think there is still a place for a bit more conversation about the alcohol and cancer risk link.
Fantastic. All right, the comments and questions are flooding in, which is great. Continue to send them on in. Sheena has just posted, from the qualitative comments, it would appear that the risky drinking when I was younger concerns highlight a need to target the younger LGBTQ plus communities. I wonder, rather than throwing that to you, Simon, I wonder, Wing, from your results, is there anything you would particularly highlight or add relative to what you've already presented around findings by age?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe some people have a slightly different perception of what risky drinking looks like, as identified in Simon's interviews. So maybe what they're getting at is the sort of, smashing a few drinks and passing out on a late night out. The sort of heavy single occasion drinking they would consider risky, but a lot of people might not consider sort of long-term sustained frequent drinking as being risky. So that weekly guideline of 10 plus drinks, more than 10 drinks a week, is more common amongst the older adults, and that is what has a stronger link to sort of long-term health impacts like cancer. So they're different groups. The younger group is more sort of short-term risks like injuring yourself, whereas more sustained heavy drinking, which some people might not consider to be risky, is what's going on here with the cancer risk.
And maybe perhaps to add to that, I might pop Bianca's comment in there, or question in next. Bianca asks, are there risks of cancer associated with LGBTQ plus older people who have stopped heavier drinking earlier in life in the same way as tobacco? So if I'm interpreting it right, is it that they're stopping drinking earlier, there's still risks, but maybe they're lessened? I don't know, Nikki or Scott, would you be able to comment on that one at all?
Just highlights to me that there's so many things that impact cancer risk, and alcohol's only one of them. So I think changing your drinking from less heavy drinking at any time is going to be beneficial, but I'm not sure how that, I don't know the impact of that compared to other behaviours.
Yeah, and I don't have a specific answer to that, but I think, I think the connection in the research between alcohol and cancer is limited in comparison to what we know about tobacco, smoking, and cancer. And I think there's a lot that we still need to understand about the mechanisms and maybe how alcohol, the relationship, and how long or when reducing that alcohol consumption, you might see changes in the cancer risk over time.
Yes. And there's some, Sheena's just saying, if big alcohol got the same negative media exposure that big tobacco gets, we might find a more educated population when it comes to alcohol-related cancer risks in Australia. I might just go back to Simon with a question, and you only touched on it briefly, Simon, but I know you mentioned that a few of your participants had attempts to cut back, but they weren't successful. Not to put you on the spot, but did they tell you a bit more about why they weren't seeing success when they did have those attempts?
I got the impression that they just kind of ran out of steam, that it's a lot of work to completely change your entire lifestyle and then continue doing that. But so it was the people who gradually had big changes in their life and reduced their alcohol intake as a result. Those were the ones who kind of stayed, had lower alcohol intake ongoingly. The people that I spoke to who kind of went on a health kick and decided to stop and had that very clear drinking lots and then not at all. It just wasn't sustainable because the benefits or the euphoria or the joy of seeing all those big changes kind of dissipated after a month or two, and then it just got a bit hard and they got bored. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. I really put you on the spot there. And thank you to Kate in the comments for sharing their experience. And also, I guess the main point here, reinforcing the importance of having options for people and for having those options in terms of seeking support and treatment across all ages, not focusing necessarily on a specific age group, which I think is another message that's kind of coming through quite clearly here. Looking at the questions and looking at my questions, is that mean? Is that rude if I start to ask some of my questions as well? I mean, Scott and Nikki, I'm going to ask you the difficult question. So Simon said that there were some people who challenged the link between the idea of alcohol and cancer. And Scott, you've already talked a little bit about we don't have as the same level of evidence or the same amount of study as we would see for tobacco. What do we do for those people who say it doesn't exist or it's really complicated? Or Simon, I think you said not defensive, but just skeptical. Would that be the way you describe it? What can we do for those people?
So I think this is a journey, and we're not going to, provide the information and provide information in a way that's going to change everybody's kind of attitude towards this. I think something that we often hear is you can't pinpoint my alcohol consumption to me getting this particular cancer, which is difficult to do. And we have this evidence about alcohol causes 8 different types of cancer based on broader communities surveys, not just individual people's behaviors and their cancer. I think people, in the work that I've done in cancer prevention and screening, is that people often want to know the mechanisms in which a risk factor causes the cancer. And I think in some cases that's been really helpful. I know in the work I did on skin cancer prevention and particularly melanoma, helping people understand how that sun exposure does lead to melanoma did help people, convince people of that and to reflect on their behaviors. But that takes time, and I'm not sure that that's the approach we'll necessarily take in our campaign response, because I think that can get very fear-based, and we don't see that as the direction that'll be right for our community at this time.
Thanks, Scott. And Nikki, anything you would add from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's people's understanding of health often needs to be about their own personal story, you know, like how does this relate to me? And that thought that there's no link probably relates very much to that personal experience. So a population risk has definitely been established. That person's personal risk is something that they need to weigh up, and might become evident depending on their health. So we need to make sure that we present really good evidence about why we're doing this work and that we do it, because it, you know, that invisibility is interesting, isn't it, of cancer that was perceived. But we also have a responsibility to try and make the information relatable and salient, I guess. And that, yeah, that's what campaigns and other health programs are about. You know, we try and do as good a job as we can to use the evidence to develop campaigns and other activities that get people to consider making changes and then make those changes when they're able to do that.
Thanks, Nikki. And thank you to all four of you for your contribution. I'm just sitting here reflecting on it all. There's some fantastic take-home messages. And I think, thinking about the individual, thinking about diversity between individuals. I think maybe Nikki described it as a conversation, a journey. So I think, some really important messages there. So thank you, Wing and Simon, for the fantastic presentations. Thank you, Nikki and Scott, for your contribution, for the collaboration, and for the exciting next steps to see where this goes. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. If you're excited about the NDARC webinar series for the rest of this year, fear not, we have 2 more webinars lined up. So on Thursday, the 8th of February, we have effective 12-week e-cigarette use on smoking abstinence at 1 year, results from the E3 trial, and that is being presented by Professor Kristen Fillion. So I think it's got e-cigarette in the title. I think that's going to be a hot topic for the 8th of February. And then Thursday, 15th of February, we're back at NDARC again. We have our research fellow, Dr. Jessie Lim, presenting on suicide by poisoning in Australia, patterns of medicine usage and targets for means restriction. So again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our presenters and panelists, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.